May 3rd, 1999, a date that lives in infamy in the world of weather. On that day, a large, violent tornado tore through Bridge Creek, Moore, and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Not only was it the first F5 tornado to strike the state since 1982, it would soon be known as the strongest tornado on record. Mobile Doppler radar recorded winds of approximately 321 miles per hour, the strongest winds ever observed on Earth. Other tornadoes got close to this afterwards, including the infamous 2013 Reno tornado. But a little over 25 years after the Moore F5 and nearly 11 years after the 2013 Reno tornado, another twister had estimated peak winds in excess of 300 miles per hour, and this time it wasn't in Oklahoma. On May 21st, 2024, what started out as a run-of-the-mill severe weather day ended up being enshrined in history. A series of tornadoes tore across parts of Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. But all the attention was on one tornado. A violent EF4 twister that tore through portions of the city of Greenfield, Iowa. The tornado, despite its rating, had radar estimated winds between 309 to 318 miles per hour, becoming one of the strongest tornadoes in world history by wind speed. So today, I would like to take a deep dive into the May 21st, 2024 tornado outbreak, with the primary focus on the Greenfield, Iowa EF4 tornado. I'll be covering the synopsis, the events as they occurred, the aftermath and response, and how the city of Greenfield is doing today. Welcome to Nature's Fury. The events of May 21st, 2024 were actually part of a much more widespread outbreak sequence that transpired from May 19th through the 27th. For the sake of this video, I will only be covering the events of May 21st. In the mid to upper levels of the atmosphere, a distinct shortwave trough was ejecting to the northeast from the Central Plains into portions of the Midwest. Closer to the surface, a developing inland cyclone pushed to the northeast, with an associated warm front and cold front moving alongside it. The expectations for the event were as follows. A line of storms from the day prior would move through Iowa. Following these storms, quick air mass recovery was expected. Surface cyclogenesis was expected, with the amplification of a shortwave trough from the Central High Plains to the upper Mississippi Valley, yielding substantial amplification of low to mid-level flow, with a belt of 70+ knot 500 millibar winds extending from eastern Kansas and western Missouri through at least Iowa this afternoon. As the surface cyclone deepened, an attendant cold front would surge eastward through central Iowa through northwest Missouri by 0Z. Steep mid-level lapse rates would overspread the warm sector, supporting aggressive diurnal destabilization, especially on the southern fringe of lingering convection or cloud cover. Initially, supercell development would occur near the developing surface cyclone by midday to early afternoon over the mid-Missouri Valley, with increasing widespread thunderstorm development through the afternoon from the upper Mississippi Valley southward to the lower Missouri Valley. Deep layer shear would support an initial mixed mode of semi-discrete supercells and embedded supercells in clusters. Those supercells would bring the threats of large hail and potentially strong tornadoes. The storms would grow upscale by late afternoon into a fast-moving arc of Boeing line segments and embedded supercells as the system raced to the east. Additional supercells would develop downstream of the effective warm front as well. So, what did our numbers look like? At the 500 millibar level, there was 60 to 70 knots of southwesterly flow going into Iowa. Low-level shear wasn't overly strong. At the 850 millibar level, there was 30 to 40 knots of southerly flow in Iowa and into Wisconsin. Effective bulk shear ranged from 50 to 60 knots, peaking at around 70 knots between 18 and 20 Z in Iowa. And effective storm relative helicity ranged from 200 to 300 meters squared per second squared, peaking at around 400 meters squared per second squared between 19 and 21 Z. So despite the lower amounts of low-level shear, shear profiles were still good overall. Instability was high. Mixed layer CAPE in southern and central Iowa ranged from 2,000 to 3,000 joules per kilogram, and mid-level lapse rates were high, ranging from 7 to 8.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. While there aren't soundings in Des Moines, we do have some soundings from Topeka and Davenport. In the Topeka sounding, instability was very high, at around 3,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, and mid-level lapse rates of 8.4 degrees Celsius per kilometer. The hodograph does look interesting, but there's clear steering with height with the winds. The Davenport sounding had mixed layer CAPE of roughly 1,400 joules per kilogram, and mid-level lapse rates of 8.2 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Now let's look at some RAP model soundings, courtesy of Chase Archive. There's plenty of instability here, roughly 3,300 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE, and 7.4 degrees Celsius per kilometer mid-level lapse rates. Notably, it seems like low-level shear was underdone here from what was actually seen. The Storm Prediction Center had their eyes out on this system for quite a bit before storms occurred. On May 17th, a large Day 5 15% risk was issued for portions of the Central Plains through parts of the Midwest. Throughout the following days, the SPC continued to issue outlooks for the region. At the second Day 2 outlook, a moderate risk was outlined for portions of Iowa and Illinois for a 45% significant wind contour for that region. At the first Day 1 outlook, the moderate risk was expanded. A 15% significant tornado contour and a 45% significant hail contour was introduced. The 45% significant wind contour was expanded as well. The following outlooks remain mostly similar, mainly changing as the storms move through the region. With the forecast well known by meteorologists, nobody had any idea as to what this event could have entailed. Throughout the early morning hours, a line of storms that originated from areas further west moved into Iowa, and soon left the state by 17Z. In its wake was an atmosphere that was becoming very volatile. Shortly after 9 a.m. Central, storms fired on the Nebraska-Kansas border, and quickly became supercellular by 10:50 a.m. At 11:12 a.m., a tornado watch was issued for portions of Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. Additional storms fired in southeastern Nebraska shortly after noon. At 1:10 p.m. Central Daylight Time, a particularly dangerous situation, or PDS tornado watch, was issued for portions of Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, with a 90% probability of 2 or more tornadoes and an 80% probability of 1 or more strong tornadoes. But by this point, the storms that would soon be responsible for the twisters that day had already formed. By the time the storms entered Iowa, they were congealing into a line, but it wasn't a line of storms like a QLCS, it was more so a line of embedded supercells. By 2:30 p.m., tornadoes were touching down, starting with an EF1 tornado that moved to the south of Red Oak. However, just to the south, a new supercell was quickly getting its act together, and by 2:43 p.m., it produced the first major tornado of the day. At 2:43 p.m. Central Daylight Time, a tornado touched down next to West Jericho Creek to the south of Neiman. The twister began on an easterly path before moving to the northeast, producing EF0 to EF1 damage to trees and outbuildings before it traveled into Montgomery County at around 2:50. Its weak nature continued as it moved through parts of southern Montgomery County, but it started to intensify as it passed to the east of Vasilla and over 250th Street, taking down a cell phone tower as it continued to the northeast. It next hit a farmhouse and its off-buildings off of 240th Street at around 255 at EF2 intensity, before crossing over US Highway 71 at around 2:57 p.m., then US Highway 34 shortly thereafter. It was during this time when Tristan White got caught up in a situation. He was caught in the outer circulation of the twister. So, you told me this, that you really got hit by it? And what exactly, at what point was during the tornado's life was that? And what was that like?
Okay, so ultimately what happened was we turned east on the road. The tornado was still southwest of the intersection of US 34 and it was either 59 or 71. I can't remember. I'm sorry. But like we were just north of that intersection. My chase partner, Michael Honesty, I was with at the time, a good friend of mine and fellow chaser. We turned east on a road, and ultimately I was a little confused because the plan was to like, or internally I thought we were gonna go south to that intersection, go east on 34, and be on the south side of the tornado, stay out of its path. But we turned east on this gravel road, and I'm thinking, I don't know if we should be doing this. I told him, "You sure we should be going this way?" And he was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah, we'll be all right, I think." But again, you got to remember this thing was moving at 60 miles per hour. So we kept going east. As I was filming this tornado, I noticed that this tornado was rapidly accelerating. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, at one point, it looked like it was moving slow. And then the next moment, it looked like it just speeded up exponentially. And we got to a T intersection. The tornado was like directly to our southwest. And we're like, and I'm like, oh crap. Like, we don't have much time to get out of its way. We're likely going to get hit by it. So, I tell Michael to go south. I tell him to turn right on this road. And as we're going south, the tornado is rapidly approaching us. The outer circulation um, starts basically hitting us. There was this house. Nobody was home at the time. And there was this, we just stopped at this house basically. And at this point, it was pretty much too late to get out of its way. I mean, the circulation was already essentially hitting us. We were on the outer edge. All we could really do was just ride it out. So we stopped at this house and we just basically let it pass. My ears were popping basically, and it was like one of the loudest sounds I've ever heard. Like, obviously, it sounded like a waterfall as it just passed directly overhead. There was a tree that was getting completely shredded, that like right behind Michael's vehicle. Obviously, I got footage of that as it was happening, and the tornado just quickly passed through. Like, it was like maybe 30 seconds at most, and then we watched the tornado track off to the northeast. There was a shed. Unfortunately, the shed was on the other side of the house, so I couldn't see it as it was taken out. But that little shed was collapsed by the tornado.
The tornado produced EF0 to EF1 damage as it traversed through the rest of Montgomery County before crossing over into Adams County at around 3 p.m., then crossing over 200th Street and striking a home and a metal building system at around 303. It continued to the northeast, striking a farm off of Aspen Avenue at around 304. As it crossed 175th Street at 3:06 p.m., the twister began producing EF3 damage as it struck a home, tearing it down to its interior walls with winds of 150 miles per hour. The twister moved over rural land for a while before it reached 150th Street at 3:08 p.m., reaching its peak intensity with estimated winds of 155 miles per hour as it struck houses off of the street, tearing them down to their interior walls. The tornado's intensity became more inconsistent as it moved to the northeast, at a more easterly direction this time, but likely remained powerful as it crossed over 140th Street at 3:10, producing minor damage to a structure to the west of the main path, then snapping power poles off of 130th Street at 3:14. It then crossed Hickory Avenue a few minutes later. As it crossed over State Highway 148, the twister produced its last area of EF2 damage to power poles on the highway, continuing on its east-northeasterly path before lifting at 3:21 p.m. after crossing Maple Avenue. The Carbon, Iowa EF3 tornado was on the ground for 38 minutes and traveled roughly 34.5 miles with a peak width of 3/4 of a mile and estimated peak winds of 155 miles per hour. The tornado was not noted to have caused any deaths or injuries. But as the Carbon tornado was on the ground in southwestern Montgomery County, just to the south, a new tornado was about to begin. It would be on the ground for 48 minutes, Half of that time it would be on the ground simultaneously with the Carbon EF3. But little did the world know that this tornado would make the history books as one of the strongest tornadoes ever recorded by wind speed. At 2:57 p.m., a twister touched down at the intersection of 110th Street and Vine Avenue in far northeastern Page County, producing minor damage before crossing into Taylor County, then into Adams County just a few minutes after touching down. During its early stages, its appearance was rather interesting. Down at the surface, you can clearly see the multiple little subvortices in the main circulation as it moved through the open fields, tearing trees apart. Also during this footage, you can see as time progresses how at the top of the tornado it becomes much more well-defined. The twister continued being weak for a while, striking some outbuildings off of 270th Street and breaking wooden power poles at around 3 p.m., crossing 265th Street about a minute later, and then over 260th Street at around 3:02. By 3:05 p.m., the twister missed the town of Brooks a few miles to the west of town, destroying grain bins and moving them north into a field before crossing US Highway 34 shortly thereafter. While crossing over State Highway 148 at around 3:14, the twister began producing EF2 damage, destroying an outbuilding and severely damaging a home nearby. By 3:17 p.m., it had crossed 170th Street, and began producing EF3 damage as it struck a home near Notchwood Avenue. Damage became limited as it soon crossed over 135th Street and 130th Street at around 3:23, and it soon crossed over an open field between 120th Street and 130th Street. It was around this time when the Dominator crew saw the tornado in its most well-known phase, with multiple smaller subvortices that were swirling around the parent vortex. While I can't show their footage on screen, it looked unreal as it tore apart wind turbines in an open field. Damage became more limited due to the rural terrain, but while I described the tornado's rating with its strength, it was very much stronger than what its rating suggests for the next while on its path. Further off in the distance, David Foster got a view of the twister too, and he told me what he saw.
I remember the sounds. There was like three main sounds I could hear. The first one was like the low, distant rumbling of thunder. You know, when you have an intense spring or summertime thunderstorm and it's just that rumbling and booming in the distance that doesn't stop. It just keeps going. So there was that. It was very calm. There was little to no wind, which was pretty unusual because the other tornadoes that I had intercepted and observed, the inflow or RFD around the tornado was insane to the point that I started bringing hair ties on my chases with me because I couldn't see anything other than my hair flying around. So with this tornado, it was just so calm. There was crickets chirping so loudly, and it was just very peaceful, kind of watching the tornado go through this wind turbine field a few miles away from me. And as I think where I was, the closest it got to me at that point, while I could still see it, was about 3.5 to maybe 4.5 miles away. So not super close, but the thing that caught my attention the most was when it did get that close, you could hear a very distinctly different roaring, rumbling noise than the thunder. Kind of just sounded like a jet engine or like a plane was flying low somewhere nearby. But it was so clear to me, and I was like, okay, that's when I realized like it wasn't just an average run-of-the-mill normal strength tornado. Like this was definitely something that had a little more kick to it. And then very rapidly, within the span of like 45 seconds, this rain shaft had appeared on the southwest side of the tornado and moved in front of it, since the supercell at this point was getting line embedded into this like nasty, messy thing. And so I lost visual on the tornado within the span of like 1 minute right after I was filming videos of it.
The twister crossed over into Adair County at 3:25, then moved close to the community of Gilead at around 3:28, producing EF1 to EF2 damage to outbuildings and homes. But as the twister crossed Fontell Road at 3:30, the twister's damage quickly became violent as it produced EF4 damage to a home off of the road, tearing down all of its walls. Shortly after, it produced EF4 damage again to a home off of 310th Street. Before it crossed 310th Street, Celton Henderson was driving down the road, unknowingly driving right through the path of the twister. He told me what it was like as he realized something was wrong. He told me what he experienced and what was going through his mind as the twister moved behind him.
Yeah, so as I was driving along 310th Street, all of a sudden the rain let up a lot and the wind started to ramp up significantly. Um, I had a suspicion that there was some kind of, a circulation or, a mesocyclone that was starting to pass overhead, and I knew I was in a bad spot at that point. But my first thought was that it was the carbon tornado. It just somehow caught up to me. I mean, I knew that it had to have been moving at like 100 plus miles per hour to get to that point before I did, which didn't make sense to me in the moment, but I couldn't think of any other way in which the tornado could have caught up to me like that. So I was completely confused about that, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that there was something passing very close next to me. And I turn around to look behind me in my rearview mirror, and I can just see like a dark shadow in the vague shape of like a funnel going all the way to the ground very close behind me. And as I looked behind it, I could clearly see debris and dust starting to fly like across the road I was just driving past like very quickly. At that point I realized it was it was a strong tornado that was passing right behind me.
Following that, the tornado crossed over Jordan Avenue, producing EF4 damage once more to a home, and intense damage to other buildings nearby. It was around this time when the twister started to take a more rightward turn. Sure, it was continuing on a northeasterly path, but the slight tilt in its direction put the town of Greenfield, Iowa directly in its path. Crossing over 270th Street, the twister produced EF2 damage to an outbuilding, then producing EF3 damage as it struck a home off of 265th Street at 3:37 p.m., then hitting a home off of Lewis Avenue at 3:28. The damage lessened in intensity for a while. Then it moved into Greenfield, Iowa at around 3:38. Crossing through the southern part of town, it produced a narrow yet extreme path of devastation, producing EF4 damage to homes left and right. The twister produced less extreme damage for a while between Southeast 3rd Street and State Highway 92, producing EF3 damage there. During this time, a down nearby was able to capture the winds of the tornado about 144 feet off the ground. Translated to ground level, the twister had an instantaneous wind gust between 309 and 318 miles per hour. Only the third tornado to achieve winds on a Dow in excess of 300 miles per hour. After crossing State Highway 92, the twister began producing EF4 damage to homes and businesses off of Southeast 5th Street, Southeast 6th Street, and East Iowa Street, hitting the Adair County Memorial Hospital in the process. Residents of the town took shelter as the twister roared across their homes. Roseanne Freeland waited until the last minute to get to the basement with her husband. Seconds later, they could see daylight and the destruction the twister brought with it. Valerie Warrior went into her furnace room, holding onto her cat for dear life as she heard the sound of a large train over her. Raymond Young was in his neighbor's garage talking with them when the twister approached. He was 10 seconds away from the twister ripping the garage into pieces. There are many more stories that I can't mention due to time constraints. After leaving town, less is known about the damage it produced, mainly because it didn't hit much. It traveled over rural fields while the supercell produced another tornado to its south. The twister crossed over Quebec Avenue, and shortly after it lifted at 3:45 p.m. The Greenfield, Iowa tornado was on the ground for 48 minutes, traveling a total of 43.07 miles with a peak width of 1,600 yards. An estimated peak winds of 175 to 185 miles per hour based on the EF scale, with unofficial estimated peak winds ranging from 309 to 318 miles per hour based on the Dow measurements. The tornado killed 5, injured 35, and caused roughly $31 million in damages. While the Greenfield Tornado was on the ground, the supercell produced another twister, an EF2 that tore through the rest of Adair County. The next twister produced by the supercell was a long-track EF2 that moved through Polk and Story counties. From 12Z to 12Z, there were 37 tornadoes. 10 EF0s, 23 EF1s, 2 EF2s, 1 EF3, and 1 EF4. The strongest of which was the Greenfield EF4. There were also the threats of large hail and strong winds. In total, there were 428 wind reports, with 13 of those being for winds in excess of 65 knots, and 149 hail reports, with 17 of those being for hail in excess of 2 inches in diameter. The strongest non-tornadic wind gust observed was 100 miles per hour in both Atkins, Iowa, and Gratiot, Wisconsin, and the largest hail observed that day was at 3 inches in diameter near Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and a separate instance of 3-inch hail at Santa Ana, Texas. But all the focus was on what was left after the Carbon and Greenfield tornadoes. Damage from the Carbon Iowa EF3 was minor at the start of its path. There was some metal sheeting in a field, and hardwood trees had their trunks snapped. An outbuilding off of M Avenue was destroyed. Off of 110th Street, a barn was slid off of its foundation. Further to the north, off of Montgomery Page Street, outbuildings were destroyed and even more hardwood trees were snapped. At the intersection of Q Avenue and 265th Street, a building was missing part of its roof and a tree trunk nearby was snapped. The first area of significant damage was off of 265th Street, where a cell tower had collapsed onto the ground. Significant damage continued at the intersection of 240th Street and T Avenue. Outbuildings were destroyed, trees were uprooted, and the farmhouse nearby was badly damaged, missing most of its roof and the upper story being hit the hardest. Off of US Highway 71, a large garage with the living quarters was blown over the rest of the house, which had strong anchoring to the foundation. The damage lessened in intensity for a short while as it produced EF1 damage to trees and residences. After moving into Adams County, it began to produce more significant damage, starting with an outbuilding that had lost part of its wall, and a metal building where the column anchorage failed. Farm buildings off of Aspen Avenue were destroyed, with debris thrown into a nearby field. Off of 175th Street was where the damage became more intense. A steel frame outbuilding was destroyed. Another outbuilding to the north was decimated. A similar story happened to the one to the north of that, but it was the main residence where the worst of the damage was. The home had almost all of its exterior walls gone, with the exception of some interior walls, and the walkout basement was still intact too. Off of 170th Street, a house had most of its exterior walls collapsed, with only some of the interior walls left remaining. But it was off of 150th Street where the damage was at its worst. The twister struck the house with estimated winds of 155 miles per hour, leaving behind a ton of debris and a few of the inner walls. The walkout basement survived the onslaught alongside the porch. Off of 130th Street, power poles were snapped, and off of Hickory Avenue laid trees that were snapped. The last area of damage noted from the Carbon Iowa EF3 was an outbuilding that was slid off of its foundation. The first signs of damage from the Greenfield tornado came off of Willow Avenue, where one outbuilding was only left with some of its walls still up, while another one nearby was completely destroyed. Damage for the next bit of its life was relegated to trees. Off of 270th Street, there were broken power poles, some tree limbs that were snapped, and an outbuilding that had a wall removed alongside its roof. Minor damage to homes and major damage to outbuildings continued as it moved to the northeast. Minor tree damage was obvious as well. Grain bins on 235th Street were destroyed and moved into a field. Multiple trees off of US Highway 34 were uprooted. Minor damage was reported to a home off of 220th Street, an outbuilding off of Hickory Avenue, and a house off of Holly Avenue. The first instance of significant damage came off of State Highway 148, where a house sustained extensive damage to some of its outer walls and its roof, and an outbuilding nearby was blown down, with the exception of one of the walls. The next area of damage reported was off of Corning Carl Road, with an outbuilding missing part of its roof and a residence having some roofing materials missing too. The first instance of EF3 damage was near the intersection of Notchwood Avenue and 150th Street. A house was nearly fully destroyed down to where the basement was visible. The porch was mostly fine though. The damage nearby was also significant. Outbuildings were destroyed and trees were snapped and had debris wrapped around them. The twister had estimated maximum winds of 165 miles per hour at this location, but it was likely higher than that. Off of Orange Avenue and 135th Street, outbuildings were damaged or destroyed, and homes suffered from minor roofing loss. Between 120th and 130th Street laid a wind turbine farm. Many of them had fallen down due to the twister. Near Gilead, a harvester silo was overturned. A house suffered from minor siding damage, and even more wind turbines were knocked down. In an open field, metal truss towers collapsed and an outbuilding was destroyed just to the east of there off of Fontanelle Road. To the north was where the damage became violent. A house was completely destroyed and removed from its foundation. Trees nearby were snapped and debarked. An outbuilding right next to the home was completely destroyed as well. At 310th Street, another house was destroyed with all of the walls having collapsed during the twister. The outbuildings nearby were no match for the tornado. The damage tapered off in intensity for a short while, up until it reached 290th Street, where another house was completely destroyed. Off of Jordan Avenue, on the eastern half of the street, a house was severely damaged, and hardwood tree trunks were snapped. Softwood trees were debarked with only the stubs of the largest branches remaining. On the western side of the road, trees were debarked, and the home nearby was completely destroyed, with the debris collapsed into the basement. Near the intersection of Kent Avenue and 270th Street, an outbuilding was totally destroyed, with vehicles piled up nearby. An instance of major damage was observed off of 265th Street. A home that had all of its walls collapsed and was seemingly wiped off of its foundation. The next area of damage was to a house that had all of its walls collapsed on Lewis Avenue. Damage continued as you got closer to Greenfield. Then, you got into the town itself. Widespread devastation. At 503 Southwest 3rd Street, a home was blown away in the wind. The house right next door was in a better state, but was still heavily damaged. Homes along Southwest 2nd Street were hit hard too. At 506 Southwest 2nd Street, a cinder block home was obliterated and turned into a pile of debris. You can clearly see what was inside the house from the debris itself, including drawers that had dishware. The cinder block home was simply no match for the twister. At 510 Southwest 2nd Street, a house was ripped apart with a ton of debris deposited in front of the house. Sometime after the twister, 3 American flags were planted in front of the residence. Across the street at 505 Southwest 2nd Street, another home was completely swept away by the tornado. The house was turned into nothing more than a pile of debris, with bent anchor bolts found at the residence too. The bulk of the EF4 damage was found between Southwest 2nd Street and Southwest 3rd Street. At 103 Southwest Oak Street, a large family home was swept down to its foundation. The homes on 417, 419, 420, 422, and 424 South 1st Street had all of their walls collapsed. The next damage point with photos was at 421 South 1st Street. The house was fully destroyed, with debris deposited into the basement. Similarly, at 416 Southeast 2nd Street, another home was obliterated by the twister with debris deposited into the basement. Near 411 Southeast 2nd Street was where the max rating of the twister came from. A well-constructed residence that was completely swept off of its foundation. The twister had estimated winds of 185 miles per hour in this location based on the EF scale. The tornado had weakened to EF3 strength based on the EF scale for the next little bit of damage, but this is also where the Dow got their wind speed measurements. Regardless, the damage was still substantial to those who were unlucky to face it. Houses on the southern end of Southeast Kent Street were either heavily damaged or were destroyed by the twister. On the northern side of the street was where the tornado began to produce EF4 damage once more, starting at 409 Southeast Kent Street, where a house was turned into a pile of debris with said debris thrown into the basement. Homes along Southeast 5th Street and Southeast Jackson Street were similarly destroyed. At 105 Southeast 6th Street, a home with a walkout basement was destroyed, with debris deposited into said basement. The house right next to it was similarly destroyed. It was left unrecognizable as a pile of debris. At 606 East Iowa Street, the house there was destroyed too. The house next door was ripped apart by the tornadic winds. Only part of the house next door was left standing, albeit just barely. At 702 East Iowa Street, yet another home was destroyed. The last area of EF4 damage was to the house located at 704 East Iowa Street. The house was pretty much destroyed in its entirety. Near the intersection of Northeast 8th Street and East Iowa Street was where more homes were damaged, and it was the last area of EF3 damage. The last area of damage noted was to an outbuilding off of East Iowa Street, which was completely gone. There were other tornadoes that day, but damage photos are limited. Immediately following the Greenfield tornado, search and rescue began. With the hospital damaged, a makeshift hospital was put up in a lumberyard. Soon, the schools would be turned into triage centers as well. Everyone became makeshift ambulances. Ray Sorensen, a member of the Iowa House of Representatives, pulled a guy out of the rubble, put him in a makeshift stretcher, then in the back of a truck to be taken to be seen. Those who had sustained serious injuries had to be flown out to hospitals in areas such as Des Moines. Following the twisters, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds declared a state of emergency for multiple counties. And by May 24th, President Joe Biden signed off on a major disaster declaration for Adair, Polk, Story, and Montgomery counties. Many charities came in to help in the aftermath, such as the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. But it was mostly the townspeople of Greenfield who did the hardest work. They spent the day after the tornado clearing debris, and electric crews were working on rebuilding power lines. Businesses such as Tiger Drive-In welcomed people who were hit hard by the twister, giving them ice cream and soda. It was the community that was hit the hardest that did the hardest work. So a little over 2 years later, how was the town of Greenfield doing today? On May 21st, 2024, history was made in the realm of weather. A widespread outbreak of twisters tore across portions of the Midwestern United States, mainly in the states of Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The worst of the outbreak was relegated to southwestern Iowa, where embedded supercell thunderstorms produced multiple tornadoes. Mainly, one supercell produced 2 intense to violent tornadoes. The first twister was an intense EF3 that roared over the rural countryside of Page, Montgomery, and Adams counties, with peak estimated winds of 155 miles per hour based on the EF scale. But it was the second tornado that was the most well-known, an insanely powerful and unique tornado that started off similar to a landspout before becoming a violent, powerful twister that ended up tearing through the southwestern portion of the town of Greenfield, Iowa. While moving through the town, the twister had a sustained, instantaneous gust ranging from 309 to 318 miles per hour, one of the highest ever measured by a Doppler on wheels. While the damage at first doesn't scream one of the strongest tornadoes of all time, the fact that it was able to move parking stops, which Ethan Moriarty analyzed to have taken winds of at least 247 miles per hour to move them, on top of the fact that debris was found 187 miles away, cements the idea that the twister was likely one of the strongest tornadoes we've seen in the past decade. The Dow measurements seem to back this up. So looking back a little over 2 years later, how is the town of Greenfield doing today? In May 2024, the fire department moved into a temporary station after their station was severely damaged by the twister. In June, the Greenfield United Methodist Church started a lost and found for those who had lost items that may have been found in the aftermath. And the hospital in town announced that they would remain closed for at least the next 3 months. An annual golf fundraiser was renamed after Pam Wiggins, one of those who died during the Greenfield tornado. Members of the Winterset High School baseball team went to Greenfield to help with the cleanup efforts. In July, Ragbri writers stopped in the town, some of which came through and spent money to help the town out. It was also during this time when something odd started to happen. Corn started growing in Greenfield. As it turns out, it seems like the Greenfield tornado picked up corn seeds from silos and fields, and the twister carried them as it traveled through the town. The seeds were planted in the soil, and the heavy rain helped them grow as well. It was also during this month when David Foster visited the town himself, and he told me his experience in the town when he visited.
Right. So I had some family come out for the 4th of July weekend, and they're all somewhat interested in weather because of me. So we were down doing something southwest of Des Moines. I forgot. I think we were at a museum. And so I was like, we're only like 30 minutes from Greenfield. Do you guys want to go, look around town and see what residual damage and if there's any like cleanup going on still? And they're like, yeah, sure, why not? We went into town, just got some ice cream, and we went to an Amish store in the downtown square of Greenfield. And so it was just like browsing the aisles, and this guy had come in on a motorcycle and was talking to the cashier lady for a few minutes, and then he walked back out. And so I brought my stuff up to the counter and was checking out, and I just asked this woman, and she was elderly. So I just mentioned, I was like, hey, I was in this town storm chasing a few months ago when you guys had the tornado. And so I just asked her, I was like, how was that for you? Did you guys get impacted by it at all? So she told me her story. And basically, she was at the store when the tornado came through town, and she was with her husband. They live in the house basically connected to like the back of the store. And where they live was probably about 3 or 4 blocks away from the tornado's path. So, like I had noticed in the Casey's when I was there on May 21st, she told me the sirens had started going off like 45 minutes before the storm eventually came through. And because they had been going off for so long, she just kind of thought like, oh, it must be there's like a storm nearby, but it's not actually going to hit Greenfield kind of deal. So she didn't really care that much about it until it actually started coming in. And she told me what worried her the most when she realized it wasn't just like your average one of the mill springtime thunderstorm was it got so dark in the span of 30 seconds. She said that their streetlights came on. And so she got very worried and got her husband, and they went into the bathroom on their ground floor of their house. She said they were sitting on the floor when pressure dropped so much. She said that the water in the toilet had started to bubble and gurgle, and the plumbing in their house was getting compressed because of the pressure change. And she said that, people talk about hearing a train, and she heard that train probably from all the debris that was in the air getting tumbled around and just getting dropped on everything. But she said where they lived didn't get any damage from the tornado, but they lost a couple trees in their property, downed by the associated like downburst winds, and that they had like the whole town, she said, was covered for days afterwards in bits of debris and like insulation and shingles and plywood from all the damaged houses. And she said they spent about a month picking all that debris up. And then she went on to talk about the guy with the motorcycle that had come into the store just 5 minutes earlier. She was like, that guy that had come in, his house was completely destroyed. The only thing that he has remaining with him, the only possession that survived, was the clothes he was wearing and his motorcycle, because he was out for a motorcycle ride when the tornado went through town. So he wasn't at home. But she said he's been a customer for like 10 years. And so when he came back from the motorcycle ride and found out that half of his town had just been destroyed, including his house. You know, it was just crazy to think about because it was like their interaction seemed so normal. He came to buy like a jar of like pickled eggs or pickles or something like that, and said, "Have a nice day," and walked out on his motorcycle, which is the only thing he had left. It was just crazy to think about that because that's when I started actually interacting with what the tornado had done and how it can actually impact more than just what we see in like structure damage and things. Um, that was like the one close story that I had gotten from someone in Greenfield. We went walking around the Greenfield Lake Park area, which had taken a direct hit from the tornado, and saw some of the most remarkable contextual tornado damage I've seen probably ever. There was a tree. Most of the trees had been like picked up and cleared and chopped up and put in burn piles at this point, but on the wooded hills where there wasn't any hiking paths, all the trees were still laying like as they fell in the tornado. And there was one that I had taken pictures of that was uprooted, and it was just completely sandpapered, like bare and so smooth. There wasn't a piece of bark left anywhere on it. There was frisbee golf posts that are like poured concrete 2 feet into the ground that had been ripped out of the ground and thrown dozens of feet away from where their post had been, and just crumpled up like a tin can with the concrete pole still attached to it. And the Dollar General in town was operational, but there was like four shingles sticking out the side of the wall in the entryway that had just been thrown and embedded into the sidewall, even though the building itself didn't even get hit by the tornado. It was just so, it was like putting the whole town through a sandblaster, basically, with how much debris was flying around.
In August, the Adair County Memorial Hospital partially reopened, with the entrances on the northern side of the hospital remaining closed. In October, the hospital announced a reopening date for the rest of the facility. In November, new houses were spotted under construction. The next month, the Adair County Memorial Hospital fully reopened. In May 2025, a memorial was revealed to honor the first responders, volunteers, and victims of the disaster. The volunteer fire department was working on getting a new fire station that month too. The disc golf course was also in the planning process of being rebuilt. 2 years following the twister, the town had partially rebuilt, but there is still a lot left to do. Victims were moving into new homes, and people were still coming in from out of state to help with rebuilding. Many are still dealing with the trauma from these twisters. Many are still struggling, and it's never left the consciousness of the town of Greenfield. 2 years later, the rural areas of the Iowa countryside alongside the town of Greenfield will never forget the destruction and the mental trauma the tornadoes of May 21st, 2024 caused in their communities. And it's definitely a tornado outbreak that I will not forget anytime soon. Okay, I got an important announcement that I've technically already made, but I want to bring it up again since more people are likely watching this than the announcement video I made about a week ago. I was invited by Nya Cubs to join her alongside a bunch of other VTubers to participate in their team, the Wildcats, for the 2026 VTuber Summer Slam, a charity event where people can donate to campaigns to raise money for Gamers Outreach. TLDR, Gamers Outreach collaborates with hospitals to give hospital patients easy access to video games to bring in some sense of normalcy in their lives. They do this through a variety of programs, but most notably the go-karts, which are portable video game kiosks. At the time this video has been uploaded, the event is currently ongoing, but I've been streaming every day for the event since it started on July 19th, and will continue to stream over on my Twitch, twitch.tv/Alferia, and I highly recommend checking it out. So far, my campaign has raised $450 for Gamers Outreach, and that is surely to grow as the event continues. If you are not interested in watching the streams but still want to donate, I have the campaign donation link in the description and in the pinned comment until the event ends. Please consider donating, it means a lot and will show how awesome our community is by supporting the kiddos and whatnot. Anyways, time for the credits. Special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Alto, Foxtrot, and Griff. Celton Henderson, David Foster, and Tristan White for agreeing to interviews and providing me with their footage. Ethan Johnson, Jack Kelly, and StormArtz for providing me with additional photos and videos of the tornado and its aftermath. Aster for the tornado icons I use, and of course, Celtic White for being the channel artist, and Barry for the VTuber model I use, Zinno, Crackleck, and Cyanide Blue for letting me use their music whenever I use it, and everyone for watching. It means a lot. Special thanks to those who are subscribed to the channel Patreon or are a YouTube member. Those being Dakota, Frostbite, Montpelier, Phoenix, and Queen Hyena at the Always Army tier, Autostradamus, Michelle, Techno Idioto, and Warbuff the String at the Alf Jr. tier, Bipolar Batty, Brian Hawley, Dante DMZ, Ellen Bryn, Esri, Foscrew, Foxtrot, Fry JC, Hannah Stormer, James Sullivan, Kara Kasumi Burr, King Shisa, Means Beans Machines, Rama, Tirani Rielta, and Van Granny at the Ulf MIDI tier, and everyone listed at the Ulf supporter tier. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you wish to support me financially and get access to some behind-the-scenes stuff, including stock footage, interviews, and more, consider becoming a patron or becoming a YouTube member, although more perks will be for those on the Patreon. Anyways, that's all I got. If you liked the video, consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, commenting your thoughts, sharing it around, hyping the video, all that jazz. Also, consider following me on Twitter and Twitch, and even joining my Discord server. All of that is in the description. That being said, I'm Alferia, you all stay safe, and I'll see you all soon.